Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Zeynep Gökçe. After months of campaigning that promised sweeping tariffs, Trump followed through on his threat shortly after taking office. Many of the US's largest trade partners, including Canada, China and the EU, saw steep duties imposed. While some countries have managed to forge new trade deals with Washington, many are stuck waiting to see what Trump's next move will be. But Turkiye has been an outlier. Its automotive sector is driving this year's export surge. Even amid global trade uncertainties, including Trump's tariffs, Ankara has managed to secure a favorable 15% duty on its US-bound exports. But how is Turkiye maintaining this momentum and what are its key advantages? Safia Amri reports.
Turkiye has set an ambitious goal for 2025 to become a regional export hub. Given its strong performance so far, this seems achievable. But of course, big goals come with challenges. One of the first hurdles was the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration back in April, which shook global markets. Luckily, Turkiye was on a shortlist that secured relatively lower tariffs, some as low as 15%, according to the latest announcement. Was this just luck? Not at all. Turkiye has been actively lobbying for a fair deal with the US, its second largest export market, which bought a record $16 billion worth of Turkish goods in 2024. Among these exports, chemicals and chemical products led the way, hitting $1.5 billion. Another standout sector are vehicles. Despite global trade uncertainties, Turkish auto exports hit over $23 billion in just the first 7 months of 2025. This industry has become the driving force of Turkey's economy, helping it become Europe's second largest commercial vehicle producer and the 12th biggest automotive manufacturer worldwide. Over 250 global suppliers operate in Turkiye, with 30 ranking among the world's top 50. Electric vehicles are surging in Turkiye, with sales jumping 138% in the first half of the year. Leading the charge is homegrown automaker TOG, which sold over 17,000 units. Now global giants like BYD and Tesla are eyeing Turkiye as a hub for future mega factories.
Ve çok sayıda küresel marka, 8 küresel marka.
Many global brands continue to manufacture automobiles in Turkey. Around them, there are more than 100 suppliers. And surrounding those suppliers are hundreds of sub-suppliers. In recent years, Turkey has in fact built a massive automotive industry.
Still, challenges remain. While exports are expected to grow by 10% compared to 2024, the automotive industry is struggling with a shortage of skilled technical workers, a bottleneck that could slow progress. Even with trade barriers, Turkey is performing well in global markets. Its strategic location, competitive manufacturing costs, and growing industrial base make it resilient. The country has diversified its exports beyond traditional markets, tapping into Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. While tariffs pose hurdles, Turkey's adaptability and strong industrial sectors prove it can still thrive in global trade. Safia Amri, Straight Talk.
For more, joining me now from London is Maurizio Zanardi. He's a professor at the University of Sussex. From Istanbul, Bilal Baş, an associate professor at Fatih Sultan Mehmet Vakıf University. Also from London, Vicky Pryce, chief economic advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Thank you all for joining me. Now, earlier this year, when US President Trump announced the tariffs, some economists predicted that there would be chaos. Now, Maurizio, how do you evaluate the situation so far? And do you think it's too early to make such predictions?
Yes, I think that we can agree that many of the announcements that President Trump has made have taken economists, political scientists, journalists by surprise because it's completely reshaping the way that we look at international trade, the benefits that globalization is taking, and he's doing that with a very mercantilistic approach, focused only on trading goods, basically forgetting about trading services, which are becoming even a larger share of the total trade in the world. So yes, there is chaos, and I'm afraid that more chaos is ahead of us.
Yes, and in the meantime, Turkey is doing great with its exports. It just hit a record $25 billion in July, with annual exports reaching $267 billion. Now, Bilal, is this growth sustainable, and which industries are driving this surge? And can Turkey keep up with this momentum?
It surely is sustainable. There is definitely room for more exports, I would say. The July 2025 monthly export, it was at historic peak at 25 billion US dollar. And particularly the chemical sector, auto, defense, and steel products, they're the leading sectors of Turkish export. And together with over 375 billion US dollars of service export, Turkey is actually doing pretty well. And considering the tourism exports, which are also above 60 billion US dollar. So in the past few years, as we know, the contraction in monetary and fiscal policy, it has relatively contracted the Turkish economy. But on the other hand, export sector is actually doing pretty well, and it's likely to achieve its 2028 targets as well, I would say. And all these figures, they are also despite the stagnant recessionary Europe, Germany, which are the biggest export markets for the Turkish economy. And we should also consider, of course, the earthquakes in southern Turkey and the global monetary tightening that is still going on, I would say. So it is doing very well in terms of export, and it's likely to get much better soon.
Yes, and the US trade policies aren't only affecting the global economy, it's also reshaping geopolitical realities. So, Vicky, what kind of changes have we seen so far?
I mean, you're absolutely right that what has been going on is that everyone is looking whether they need to maybe redirect exports or produce in different places in order to avoid some of the tariffs that are being imposed on exports to the US by President Trump. Turkey, it's interesting looking at its export performance, which is strong, has benefited in a way comparatively to others because the tariffs imposed on Turkey overall are about the same as they are in the UK, about 10%, although, of course, there are still higher tariffs until it's all been agreed across the globe in terms of cars and in terms of iron and steel. And there are concerns about pharmaceuticals and other areas where tariffs might, in fact, increase. But overall, Turkey, I think, has done reasonably well by comparison to others. But there is no doubt that the slowdown in world growth and the slowdown in world trade is bound to affect Turkey as much as it affects others too. And the name of the game, I think, right now is to see perhaps which parts of the world might do better and maybe ensure that trade with those parts of the world is intensified in the future.
So, Maurizio, the same time Donald Trump was making the announcement about tariffs, he was also talking about the US policy shift in the Ukraine war. And this worried the European leaders plenty. So do you think the EU leaders took this into consideration, the war and the political tensions, when making the trade deal with the US?
Most definitely. Here we cannot separate the economic aspect of the trade deal between the EU and the US from the political situation in which European leaders find themselves. And so if the question is, did the EU negotiate a good trade deal? The answer is it depends. It depends how you look at it. Some people, some commentators claim, oh, it's a terrible deal because it's a 15% base tariff and investment commitments and so on. You can look at it as a terrible deal, so maybe the negotiators were not very good, or you can think of it as the best possible deal, conditional on also making sure that the US maintains that safety guarantees a presence in Europe that is so crucially and strategically important for European leaders. So we should not look at that trade deal only for the trade aspect to it. And depending on how you look at it, then you may conclude that it was a very good deal for the EU or a very bad deal for the EU. It depends really on what is the weight that we put beyond the economic, the trade aspect on security guarantees that we are hearing a lot about Ukraine and the overall involvement of the US in Europe and beyond.
Yes, and we talked about some of the sectors that have been thriving in Turkey, and despite this uncertainty in global trade, the automotive sector has been doing quite well. Bilal, in your opinion, how did this success come by?
Well, for the Turkish case, particularly the defense industry, auto, electronics, IT, even agricultural sectors, they're playing a huge role in Turkish export figures. And I would say digital technologies, energy, and aviation, they should matter more in the future. And despite the relatively late introduction of its national brand Tog, Turkey is, as you just mentioned, is one of the leading auto producers and is home to many international brands' production facilities as well. And I would say the subsidies in the auto industry, finance incentives, and raised discount window by the Turkish Central Bank, for example, and also Turkey's trade diplomacy through multilateral, bilateral, regional, and global agreements. And I would say its focus more on global south is also very, very crucial. Its recent faraway countries strategies focus on global south, as I just mentioned. But more specifically, I would underline public incentives and relatively cheaper labor, at least compared to the US and Europe, and much higher human capital, high quality production. And as a reliable production partner, it makes Turkey a better trade partner for all these countries. And auto industry is also benefiting from this trend.
So, Vicky, what lessons should UK and other European countries take from the US tariff strategy when managing risks?
Well, the interesting thing is that if you look at Europe, for example, it is also quite conscious of the fact that it's losing competitiveness in some areas. So from imposing no tariffs, for example, on Chinese electric vehicles, it now imposes tariffs of between 35 and 45%. So what we're seeing is that every region is trying to shield itself, and that's pretty bad in terms of growth for the future. So deglobalization is, I'm afraid to say, the name of the game right now, with loads and loads of restrictions on trade. If you add to that sanctions, secondary tariffs, it just makes the environment quite difficult. So indeed, how do you respond? I think you respond by being perhaps as competitive as you possibly can. You certainly don't respond by retaliatory tariffs, because that generally means higher, it will, I think, in the EU as well, higher inflation as a result of putting tariffs on goods that the consumers really want and want to buy. So that's one of the problems. But it does, I'm afraid, also mean that both the countries that impose the tariffs, like the US, slow down by comparison to what would be the case otherwise. And the rest of the world also slows down. But there is some comfort. Markets seem to be adjusting to a tariff situation despite the uncertainty. We've seen in the last few weeks how in many areas of the world, the markets have reached record highs and have managed to retain them despite Ukraine, despite what's going on in Israel and Gaza. And that is interesting in itself, because if it is sustained, in other words, that markets learn to live with the tariffs, then we may get a better situation ahead. So even the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which was originally forecasting a drop in growth of trade for goods for 2025, has now adjusted it to a growth of just under 1%. It's still not very high, lower than before, but nevertheless, it is a slight improvement in the outlook.
And not all countries were able to cut the deal they want with the US, and the US president announced new tariffs on India over its purchase of Russian oil. Now, Maurizio, do you think tariffs will become a go-to tool for Trump to pressure countries both politically and economically?
Oh, yes, I think it has already become. And President Trump himself said that tariffs is the most beautiful word in the dictionary, right? So he seems to be using it for all possible objectives. Theoretically, tariffs are used in order to increase revenue, to pay for the deficit of the United States, to convince foreign manufacturers to set up plants in the US. So he's using tariffs to try to achieve multiple objectives. As we teach in any undergraduate modules, tariffs can achieve some of these objectives, but they are some of the most inefficient ways to achieve these objectives. And if it is true, and I completely agree with Vicky, that the markets are resilient and are adjusting, they are adjusting to the tariffs, but someone has to pay for the tariffs. And this someone, at the end of the day, are consumers because of tariffs on final products and because of tariffs on intermediate inputs that then cascade through the production process until the final output is sold in the shops, in the shopping malls, and everywhere else. So markets are resilient, and we have seen the same also during the pandemic. After a lot of concern, firms and markets reacted, but there has been a cost to it, a readjustment, and any of these readjustment introduces higher production cost. And at the end of the day, we all pay the consequences in our wallets with that.
And Turkiye is on the white list of tariffs, meaning it's included in the lowest 15% tier. So Bilal, does this give Ankara a competitive edge in global markets?
I would say it definitely does. And these additional tariffs on Turkey, they have gone up by 15%. Yet Turkey is still among the nations that are positively differentiated nowadays from the rest of the world. So Turkey has emerged positively, and it has lost additional levies or tariffs. And these tariffs or regulations or geopolitical developments, they have brought, of course, new opportunities and risks for different countries. And I would say Turkey is more on the part that is benefiting or likely to benefit from this new situation. Plus, the President Erdogan's leadership and his good relations with President Trump, they are also another factor to bear in mind, and another maybe good news for the Turkish side. And it is likely to provide a competitive or comparative advantage, if you like. Plus, I would say Turkey's geographic location, it's another huge plus for its economy and for its export industry, particularly at a time where supply chains are disrupted since at least the past 5 years, since the COVID pandemic, and higher rates on other manufacturing hubs of the world, from Asia to the US, especially in Europe, the debt issues, etc. So these are also positive signs for the Turkish economy, or things to be optimistic about. So Turkey could overall be a winner of this ongoing uncertainty, or the new normal of trade war, I would say. And there will, of course, be some negative impacts, but I would say there will be much more gains from this trade war or tariff war. And Turkey will have a relatively bigger competitive edge in this tariff war situation.
So it's been long discussed that there is a need to move away from the dollar and form a trading system independent of the US. So Vicky, do you think this is feasible in the short term?
In the short term, it will be difficult, but of course we have to bear in mind that already the use of the dollar, although still dominant, has been declining over the last few decades. So we've also seen a concern about whether there is going to be enough appetite to finance the rising US debt, US government debt. And we've seen at times both sort of China possibly, but also Japan withdrawing some of the funds, although some money has been going back again. But we've seen yields go up quite significantly again recently. So bond yields. So there is an issue as to whether the US is still considered the safe haven that it was. And indeed, as Maurizio was saying, one of the reasons for the tariffs is also to raise some money and plug some of the holes that the new bill, which has cut taxes more permanently and also has been helping, quite a lot of sectors can, in fact, be financed a little bit more easily. This is why, of course, some of the countermeasures, green subsidies are being cut and other areas, including help for the poorer in the community. So there is a bit of an issue in the US. So it is considered to be a little bit more troublesome than was the case before. And there are regions like the EU, the Eurozone, which are trying to boost the use of the euro as a reserve currency and as a currency for international transactions. And also, of course, we've seen the development of the BRICS, which is the countries such as Brazil, India, Russia, China, and South Africa, but also many others. Occasionally, I think Turkey has also taken part in that, which are beginning to see whether they can use a different payment system and maybe a different currency, maybe a digital currency, to finance trade more easily that way. So there is a shift which is happening, but you're right in the question. In the short term, it's a little bit difficult to achieve it. But in the longer term, I think the trends could well be a reduction in the dominance of the dollar.
Vicky, you just mentioned BRICS, and Brazilian President Lula da Silva actually just called on India and China to coordinate a joint BRICS response to Trump's tariffs. Maurizio, what kind of steps could these countries realistically take?
Well, if we were to try to apply a simple model, the best reaction to Trump for all the rest of the world would be not to do anything. Let Trump increase the tariffs, let the consumers in the US pay the consequences most often than not, and diversify and therefore increase the trade flows with the rest of the world. At the end of the day, as we were saying, the dollar is decreasing his hegemonic position. The United States does not account for such a large share of total trade as it used to be. So there is a way to do with less involvement with the US. So that's something that the BRICS country or any other group of country can try to do. And in a way, that's what we're already seeing happening. So, for example, I was reading recently that as of last month, Canada has imported more cars from Mexico than from the United States for the first time in history. That's a redirection of trade. So markets are resilient, but markets find other ways. And therefore, it's no surprise that also the Turkish economy is doing well in terms of its export. That's what is happening. Now, as we were saying before, this is not something that happens overnight. It takes time to adjust. And that's why the uncertainty, the chaotic behavior of the Trump administration is making, however, the long term even longer, because we don't know what may be happening tomorrow, in 1 week, or in a month. But so BRICS countries and other groups of countries can very well coordinate. That's why we also see more initiatives about trade agreements of other countries to try to lower tariffs, to lower protectionist measures somewhere else, to replace in some way the trade that once was with the United States.
So we've talked about the opportunities for Turkey, Bilal, but what about the risks? What are the biggest risks Turkey faces as the system shifts from free trade to protectionism?
Well, this new era of tariff wars, it likely means less trade, weaker growth, higher inflation, and potentially higher commodity prices, much more risk and uncertainty in general for the world economy. And this global conflict, from trade war to tariff disputes, it's causing sharp disruptions in all these aspects that we just mentioned, and including the energy and gold prices, which has spiked recently. And this negative spillover effect, negative secondary effects even, they are affecting all world markets, including Turkey. And I would even call these type of policies modern era beggar thy neighbor policies. And if you add Trump's unpredictability, unaccountability, and the resulting uncertainties and volatilities for the global economy, and this deglobalization trend or rising regionalism, protectionism that we just mentioned, these are all risk factors for all world economies, including Turkey. So we have to be careful about all these factors, but also the weak growth rate on the US side and the European side, which are the biggest trading partners for the Turkish economy. About 40% goes to the European side only. But there are also, of course, good signs too. The decreasing energy dependency on the Turkish side, it's a huge plus. And the higher nuclear and other renewable energy capacity for the Turkish side is another good thing to be optimistic about, and which is also decreasing the negative impacts, the risks. But this rising protectionism, it will likely it will mean the need for more trade and export market diversification as well. So Turkey will probably need to diversify its export markets, find new markets. But it will also mean actually the need for modernizing, for example, the customs union agreement with the EU or the Europe in general, and better compliance with, for example, carbon border adjustment mechanism or the European Green Deal. So there is a lot to think about to minimize all these risks that we are talking about.
All right, unfortunately, that's all the time we had. Thank you all for joining me on Straight Talk. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Zeynep Gökçe. If you've got any comments, please share them with us on X @StraightTalkTRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.